Do you know where your grandparents grew up? What about your great-grandparents? When did your family first come to America? I have always found it important to remember our history. My grandmother grew up in post-war East Germany. The Russians occupied Leipzig, her home. In 1961, she fled from Germany a week before the Berlin Wall went up. She had to leave behind her entire family, including her fiancé. Before her, her mother was one of 3 women who had gone to university in the early 1900s. A couple of summers ago, I traced my paternal line all the way back to the 15th century. The Barkers lived and died in Newport, Rhode Island for 300 years. Before that, they came from Suffolk, England during the Puritan Great Migration. My father is James Sherman Barker III, but he is the 10th James Barker in my family since 1475. The further I went back in history, the less there was to find on each of my ancestors. So much of our family history is forgotten through the generations. But what about our local history? Living in a town like Bow, which lacks diversity, a majority of our ancestors migrated to America from Europe during the past couple centuries. Bow was founded in 1727, almost 300 years ago. But the Abenaki, specifically the Pennacook, lived in what is now Bow, New Hampshire, for thousands of years before us. So when and why did their history disappear? This spring, I researched my essential question about the culture and demise of indigenous peoples of northern New England throughout the 17th century. The oldest ancestors of Native Americans traveled to the Americas across the Bering Strait land bridge from northeastern Asia over 20,000 years ago, and by 10,000 years ago, they had settled throughout northern, southern, and central America. Abenaki is translated from people of the Dawnland. The Native American tribes through the Americas were vastly different from each other, even between northern and southern New England. A great sachem, the leader, presided over each of the tribes. In northern New England, the position of sachem was awarded to the man who demonstrated the greatest ability to lead and was more of an advisor. In the south, sachems were maternally hereditary and had absolute power. Sachems were rarely women, but it was possible. Tribal government was led by a council of elders, both men and women. Decisions were deliberated at every angle and included the wishes of the entire tribe in lengthy arguments. Most decisions were made unanimously. Native American homes were made of saplings covered in tree bark sewn together with bone needles and evergreen roots. They were much more waterproof, insulated, and ventilated than any English homes. Their birch bark canoes were also faster than any English boat. Women did most of the work apart from hunting, including growing, harvesting, and taking care of children, constructing houses, and administering medical treatments. Over 450 plant remedies have been identified that women used to administer various ailments. Women used bark and cement for setting broken bones. Native people also counted wealth in dogs and wampum. Dogs, which were descended from wolves, were used for hunting, hauling, and companionship, especially for women. One family had at least 6 of these animals, and with the wealthier having more. Wampum was a form of shell bead currency that the Abenaki used to trade. Native people in northern New England also used bear and eagle fat to ward off the sun and insects. Many tattooed their faces, arms, and legs, which horrified the English. Young men wore their hair long on one side and cropped on the other to keep it from getting tangled in bowstrings. When boys came of age, they spent an entire winter alone in the forest. People frowned upon chatterboxes and gossips as they do today. Lastly, the idea of spirits and the supernatural was not only an English idea. Native people predicted events by the positions of certain stars on the elliptical plane around Earth, and believed in both good and evil spirits. At the end of the day, several men and women would gather together in one wigwam to smoke and entertain themselves with stories. For thousands of years, society operated this way. Then the Europeans showed up and wiped out not only the native people, but their history as well. Less than a century after Christopher Columbus landed in 1492, the number of people living in the Americas had declined from 25 million to 1 million. Whole societies in Mexico and Southern America died within weeks of initial contact with Spanish explorers and adventurers. When the British and French colonized the East Coast, over 90% of the population died out in just the 17th century alone, including in New England. The major cause for disease was smallpox. Native Americans had lived in total isolation from the rest of the world since their arrival in the Americas about 20,000 years ago. They had escaped devastating epidemics and diseases that had afflicted the rest of humankind for generations. Such diseases normally require human carriers to pass them on to others, and such conditions did not exist in the New World until after 1492. Even the common flu had devastating consequences for Native American babies and children. Other people in the world had built up immunities, but Native Americans had none, so they died in massive numbers. The first major tribe to be exterminated in North America was the Massachusetts of New England. whose population died out completely between 1619 and 1633 from a smallpox epidemic. War was another factor. The natives had no understanding of what it meant to sell land to settlers. They believed ownership meant they could still use the land. Land disputes led to many wars in New England, most notably the King's Philip War, which raged through New England in 1675 to 1676. The native peoples were defeated at the end of the war and were virtually gone from southern New England, but in areas of northern New England, where the French and British claimed disputed territory, many tribes lived on. They were weakened by war and disease, but they would not be annihilated by the colonists. Few records remain of native culture, and the vast majority are from a colonial perspective and account. Very little descendants are able to carry on the legacy of people who lived here for thousands of years longer than we have. We have to do more to recognize our regional history. My senior STEM project was to write a novel. I have attempted to write novels before, but I've never finished any story I started. A couple have gotten pretty far through, but I've never written a solid ending. Bryony, my main character, popped into my head during a geometry class in my sophomore year. She has been there ever since, fighting to have her voice heard over the din of other characters in my head, because there's a lot of them. When I decided to write her story, I knew it would be a challenge. Bryony is the descendant of a forgotten Abenaki tribe. She knows nothing of her heritage. When Bryony is transported back in time to 1717, she runs into her ancestors and they assist her in her journey of finding herself in an unfamiliar world. During this semester, I hosted a couple meetings with other young authors in which we talked about our strengths and weaknesses in writing and each shared an excerpt from our novel. I also spent over 50 hours designing characters and creating the map of Chepeso Bay, and then creating it again because it deleted itself, where Bryony's story takes place, and feverishly typing over 80,000 words in 200 pages on Google Doc. Though I have a finished manuscript, I am far from finishing with Bryony. I'll suspect I'll have to go through several more drafts before I am ready to publish the book. But I feel proud to say that I have accomplished my goal of writing Bryony's complete story, start to finish, and incorporating this information I learned from studying Northern New England Native American history this semester into my writing. In this way, if I ever publish the novel, certain aspects of Northern New England Native American history will be shared with the world. I would like to end my senior talk with a quote from Emily Walker Brooke, a woman of Abenaki Elhu descent from Vermont. As she said, "The thread along the generations is lined with stories and ceremony and music and dance that light our way through time." Any questions?